No ice, no electricity, no cold storage. Yet somehow, in an age where meat spoiled in hours and disease lurked in every bite, medieval cooks mastered the art of preservation. Behind castle walls and in humble village homes, ancient techniques kept food fresh for weeks, sometimes months. This isn't just about pickles and salt. It's about survival, innovation, and a forgotten knowledge that shaped everyday life in the Middle Ages. How did they do it? And what secrets have we lost? In medieval Europe, food preservation wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a matter of survival. With no refrigeration, no sealed packaging, and no industrial sanitation, fresh food was in a constant race against time. The moment an animal was slaughtered or a crop was harvested, the clock began ticking. Bacteria, mold, and insects worked quickly, especially in the warmer months, turning once edible provisions into dangerous vectors of illness. In many villages, the smell of rot was a familiar part of life, lingering near markets, kitchens, and storage areas. Perishability defined medieval eating habits. Fresh meat, if not salted or cooked immediately, could spoil in a single summer day. Milk turned sour within hours. Fish, especially those brought inland from coastal regions, had to be salted before transport even began. Bread, though light, could grow mold or become infested with insects. Vegetables softened and blackened, fruit fermented. In an age where microbial theory was still centuries away, people recognized the signs of spoilage, but not its causes. They relied on sensory judgments, smell, taste, appearance, and often those judgments failed. In feudal society, this problem struck hardest at the lower levels. Nobles could afford vast storerooms, imported salt, or preserved delicacies from abroad. Peasants, by contrast, had limited resources and far less margin for error. Their survival hinged on local harvests, seasonal timing, and old, often inherited knowledge of how to keep food usable for as long as possible. A failed preservation method could mean hunger or worse when winter came. With no supermarkets or supply chains, what you didn't save was what you lost. The threat of food spoilage was not merely a domestic inconvenience. It shaped agricultural planning, trade routes, and taxation. Kings levied taxes on salt and grains precisely because of their role in preservation. Monasteries became centers of knowledge partly because of their mastery of storing food year-round. And entire communities were vulnerable to sudden shifts in weather that could rot a harvest in the field, or sour stored grain in a damp cellar. Rot was not just a smell, it was a warning. Spoiled meat led to outbreaks of food poisoning. Rancid butter and contaminated grains could spread disease or cause hallucinations, as seen in periodic outbreaks of ergot poisoning from spoiled rye. During times of war or famine, when food supplies were already stretched thin, the consequences of poor preservation were devastating. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, triggered by relentless rains and crop failure, was made worse by the inability to store or protect what little food was available. Across Europe, from the forests of Germany to the marshes of England, survival demanded ingenuity. Cooks, farmers, and housewives became de facto scientists, might by choice, but by necessity. They knew which foods spoiled first, which pests invaded what season, and how quickly rot could set in. Their daily struggle against decay defined much of medieval life, long before cold storage would arrive to change everything. Salt, long before it flavored food, preserved life. In medieval Europe, it was a cornerstone of survival, especially in a world without refrigeration. From the North Sea to the Mediterranean, Salt was harvested, traded, and hoarded not just for seasoning, but for its unrivaled ability to preserve. Food, dry salting and brining were two of the most widely used methods. In dry salting, coarse salt was packed around meat or fish, drawing moisture out through osmosis. This dehydrated the flesh, making it inhospitable to bacteria. Brining, by contrast, involves soaking food in a concentrated saltwater solution. Both techniques could extend shelf life by weeks or months. The choice between them often depended on the type of food, the climate, and access to supplies. Pork, the most consumed meat in much of medieval Europe, was routinely salted in autumn, just after the annual slaughtering season. In regions like Saxony or Normandy, families would preserve entire sides of pork in wooden barrels, layering meat with salt and weighing it down with heavy stones. The process took weeks, but the results fed households through the winter. Salted pork, often boiled to reduce its intense salinity, became a staple dense with calories and durable for long journeys or lean months. Along the coasts, especially in Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and northern England, herring became central to both economy and diet. The fish were gutted immediately after the catch, then packed in barrels with layers of salt. The result, kippered or green herring, depending on the method and duration of curing. Salted herring could be stored for months and transported across the continent. By the 14th century, the Dutch herring trade was so extensive that it fueled the rise of powerful merchant fleets and coastal economies. Salted cod or saltfish was another critical export, especially from Iceland, Norway, and later Newfoundland. Cod was split, heavily salted, and air-dried, creating a lightweight but long-lasting protein source. It was shipped south to Catholic Europe, where the Church's dietary rules abstaining from meat on Fridays and during Lent created high demand for preserved fish. Salted cod fed armies, monasteries, and cities, but not all communities had easy access to salt. Inland regions faced logistical challenges and higher costs. Salt had to be transported overland by cart or riverboat, often taxed along the way. This scarcity inflated its price and gave rise to what were effectively salt monopolies. The French gabella, deeply unpopular salt tax imposed by the crown, became a source of resentment for centuries and wasn't abolished until the Revolution. In contrast, coastal areas with natural salt pans or access to rock salt mines held strategic and economic advantages. In southern France, towns like Aigues-Mortes harvested salt from shallow evaporation ponds. In Central Europe, places like Hallstatt in modern-day Austria mined deep into mountain rock to extract salt deposits, a practice dating back to prehistoric times. Salt was more than a preservative. It was political leverage, an economic engine, and a lifeline. Its role in medieval food storage was central not only to survival but to trade, taxation, and power. For medieval cooks, salt wasn't optional. It was essential, and in many places, it was guarded as fiercely as grain or gold. In medieval Europe, fire wasn't only for warmth or cooking, it was preservation technology. Before refrigeration, smoke became one of the most practical defenses against decay. In regions where salt was scarce or expensive, smoking meat offered an accessible, time-tested method to keep it edible through weeks, even months. Smokehouses were central to this process. These were simple structures, wooden huts, stone outbuildings, or even dugouts designed to control airflow and contain low, continuous smoke. The goal wasn't flame, but smolder. A slow, steady burn of hardwoods like oak, beech, or alder. produced a dense smoke that curled around suspended cuts of meat, depositing layers of preservative compounds. The science was largely unknown to medieval cooks, but the effects were understood. The aldehydes, phenols, and acids in the smoke dried the surface of the meat and created an antimicrobial barrier. This coating, combined with the heat of the fire and gradual dehydration, made the flesh hostile to bacteria. The results were not only safer to eat, but often more flavorful and easier to transport. Smoke added value culturally and practically. Pork was the most commonly smoked meat, especially in the northern and central parts of Europe. After slaughtering in late autumn, when ambient temperatures helped prevent immediate spoilage, families would cut the meat into hams, slabs, or sausages. These were hung in smokehouses for days or even weeks. Timing was critical. Too little smoke left the meat vulnerable. Too much made it bitter or tough. Sausage making became part of the preservation ritual. In German-speaking lands, traditions like Metwurst and Rochwurst took shape. Raw meat mixed with salt and spices, packed into animal intestines, then smoked until firm and dry. These could hang from kitchen beams or cellar rafters for months. Accessible at need. In parts of Scandinavia and the Baltic, smokehouses became permanent fixtures of rural households. Finnish and Swedish farmsteads often maintained dedicated structures for year-round smoking. Similar practices existed in Scotland and Ireland, where fish like haddock and salmon were routinely smoked using peat or alderwood. Fish required different techniques. Smoking had to begin quickly after the catch, especially inland where time was short and spoilage rapid. In England, smoked herring known as kippers became a commercial staple. In the Low Countries, the Dutch developed efficient smoke curing processes that allowed herring fleets to preserve their catch at sea or in port. Feeding both domestic populations and export markets, smoking was more than culinary was generational knowledge. Techniques were passed down within families, often unwritten. Each region developed its own variations, influenced by available wood, climate, and cultural taste. The color of the smoke, the dryness of the wood, even the weather on the day of smoking all influenced the outcome. Failure carried risks. Undersmoked meat spoiled silently. Oversmoked food could be inedible. The margin for error was thin, especially when supplies had to last through winter. But when done correctly, smoking turned perishable meat into sustenance that could be relied on through famine, war, or harsh seasons, an enduring link between fire and survival. In the medieval kitchen, pickling was not a preference, it was a necessity. Long before chemical preservatives or refrigeration, acidic preservation offered a reliable way to extend the life of fragile foods. Vinegar and brine became essential tools in households across Europe, allowing cooks to store vegetables, dairy, and proteins for weeks, sometimes months, beyond their natural shelf life. The principle was simple. Acid inhibits bacterial growth. In an era without any understanding of microbiology, this effect was observed, tested, and trusted through generations. Cabbage soaked in salt water turned into a sour, pungent staple, what Germans called sauerkraut. Cucumbers submerged in brine fermented into crisp, tangy pickles. Eggs, hard-boiled and then sealed in vinegar or heavily salted water, could be kept for extended periods. In monasteries and manor kitchens alike, glass jars, ceramic pots, and wooden barrels were filled and sealed at the close of the growing season to prepare for the months when fresh produce would vanish from the table. Brining and fermenting in Saltwater relied on natural lactic acid fermentation. It required only water, salt, and patience. Over several days or weeks, naturally occurring bacteria converted sugars into acids, lowering the pH and creating an environment inhospitable to harmful microbes. These methods didn't just preserve the flavor profiles they created, became deeply embedded in regional cuisines. Vinegar, especially wine vinegar in southern Europe and ale-based vinegar in the north, provided another avenue. Unlike brine, vinegar was immediately acidic, offering faster protection. On English estates, onions, turnips, and mushrooms were commonly pickled in spiced vinegar. In the Low Countries, herring was preserved in a sharp vinegar marinade, an early form of margesering which allowed it to be stored and transported inland. Pickled fish played a vital role in societies where Catholic dietary laws restricted meat consumption on numerous fast days throughout the year. In France and Italy, anchovies were layered in vinegar with herbs, salt, and oil. Scandinavians combined vinegar, sugar, and spices to preserve herring, a tradition that continues today. These preparations were not only safe, but transportable, making pickled goods valuable in local markets and long-distance trade. Pickling was especially crucial in urban centers, where market supply was inconsistent and storage limited. In cities like London, Paris, or Lubeck, pickled foods supplemented fresh goods brought in from surrounding countryside. Inns and taverns routinely served pickled eggs and vegetables as quick, reliable fare. Preserved items required no fire, no fresh slaughter, and no preparation, ideal for feeding travelers or laborers on the move. Acidic preservation left few visual traces in the historical record, but its influence can be found in recipe manuscripts and household accounts. The 15th century English form of curry and its continental counterparts include instructions for pickling nearly every edible plant part. Though these records lack detailed explanation, their presence shows that pickling was not incidentally was integrated into the culinary and economic fabric of medieval life. Without vinegar and brine, food would not have survived transport, trade, or the long European winter. The sharp tang of pickled fare wasn't a luxury. It was one of the Middle Ages' most practical defenses against hunger. Drying was one of the oldest and most accessible methods of food preservation in the medieval world. In regions with adequate sun, wind, and space, it became a seasonal routine embedded into the rhythm of rural life. Without the need for special ingredients or expensive tools, drying relied on natural forces: airflow, sunlight, and patience to extract moisture from food and inhibit bacterial growth. What remained was lighter, smaller, and far more resistant to decay. In southern Europe, where summers were long and dry, open-air drying reached its full potential. Figs, apricots, and grapes were spread across woven mats or wooden trays and left in the sun for days. The drying process concentrated sugars, transformed texture, and produced shelf-stable fruit that could last through winter. Raisins and dried figs became staples in both monastic kitchens and urban markets, often used in potages, breads, and sauces. Herbs were dried for both culinary and medicinal use. Bundles of sage, rosemary, thyme, and parsley hung from kitchen beams or attic rafters, slowly losing their moisture while retaining essential oils. These dried herbs seasoned meals year-round and were often prescribed by local healers or monks for digestive or respiratory ailments. In warmer regions, basil and mint were also harvested at the peak of summer and dried in shaded, breezy courtyards. Mushrooms, especially in the forests of Central and Eastern Europe, were foraged, sliced, and laid out to dry in the open air or under eaves. The practice was common in Slavic regions, where bolitas and chanterelles were considered valuable additions to soups and stews during winter fasts. In northern Italy, peasants and clergy alike dried porcini, storing them in ceramic jars or linen sacks. Drying meat was more complex. In warmer climates, thin strips of beef, goat, or game were seasoned with salt and hung in covered, but ventilated spaces, usually under eaves or in specialized lofts above kitchens. This semi-cured dried meat, often combined with smoke or spices, extended the life of an otherwise short-lived product. In Spain, early forms of Cechinere dried beef were recorded as far back as the 12th century, particularly in Leon. Similarly, in the Alps, air-dried sausages were strewn in upper rooms where mountain winds accelerated dehydration. Architecture played a subtle but important role. In many medieval homes, upper floors, attics, and lofts were designed or adapted to facilitate drying. South-facing windows, small vents, and exposed rafters allowed air to circulate. Food could be suspended from beams or laid on lattice, out of reach from animals but exposed to sun and breeze. In some households, seasonal drying became a communal effort before major religious festivals or the onset of winter. Drying did more than preserve. It influenced how food was prepared, stored, and consumed. Dried goods required soaking or slow cooking, often in pottages or broths. Their flavor and texture shaped regional dishes. In a world where every scrap had to last, air and time became tools as vital as blade or fire. In the absence of refrigeration, medieval communities turned to the earth itself. Beneath soil and stone, the ground offered a stable, naturally cool environment that slowed decay. From simple storage pits to complex ice houses, subterranean preservation became a quiet but vital part of daily survival. Root cellars were among the most widespread solutions, dug directly into hillsides or beneath homes. These spaces remained cool year-round, often holding temperatures between 4 to 10 degrees Celsius. Their construction was practical. Thick earthen walls provided insulation, while wooden beams or stone linings prevented collapse. Ventilation shafts allowed air to circulate, reducing excess moisture that could encourage mold. Within these dark chambers, families stored root vegetables, carrots, parsnips stacked in straw or sand to prevent shriveling. Cabbage, apples, and onions were hung from rafters or placed in baskets. In temperate regions like England, northern France, and the Rhineland, these storage spaces extended the shelf life of autumn harvests well into the spring. Storage pits served a similar purpose in areas where permanent structures were impractical. These were often dug outside the home, lined with wood or stone, and covered with earth or straw. In parts of Eastern Europe and Scandinavia, dairy products like butter and soft cheese were sealed in clay jars, buried shallowly, and kept cool. For weeks, the practice relied on predictable temperatures and minimal light exposure conditions that slowed bacterial growth without halting it entirely. In drier climates, medieval households sometimes relied on evaporative cooling. Large, porous clay pots known in the Islamic world as zia or pot-in-pot coolers were occasionally used in southern Iberia and North Africa. One pot was nestled inside another, the space between filled with wet sand. As water evaporated from the outer surface, the inner chamber cooled. Though less common in Northern Europe, variations of this technique spread through contact with the Islamic world. especially during and after the Crusades. Beyond practical domestic solutions, some elite households constructed purpose-built ice. These were rare before the 14th century, but gradually appeared on the estates of wealthy nobles and monasteries. Ice was harvested during winter from frozen lakes or rivers, then packed in deep stone-lined chambers, often covered with straw or insulating materials. When properly sealed, these stores could last well into the summer months. Ice houses were documented in Italy and southern France by the late Middle Ages, with more elaborate versions appearing in England and Germany. During the 15th and early 16th centuries, they served not only for cooling food, but also for preserving delicacies such as game meat and occasionally chilled wines for banquets. The use of underground and shaded storage reflected a broader awareness of environmental rhythms. Perishables were kept near streams, in thick-walled buildings, or in shaded courtyards. Bread was stored in cool pantries, cheese aged in stone. Cellars and ale barrels rolled into cool basements. Survival hinged on adapting to seasonal temperatures and using passive techniques to stretch the life of food through the warmer months. These methods, grounded in observation and necessity, shaped the architecture of homes, the timing of harvests, and the daily patterns of life. In a world without refrigeration, the earth itself became the most trusted ally in the fight against time. Fermentation, in the medieval world, was both necessity and tradition, an inherited craft practiced without scientific understanding, but with remarkable precision. It was a method of preserving food, but also of transforming it. Across Europe, fermentation extended the life of perishable goods, enhanced nutrition, and gave rise to some of the era's most enduring staples. Dairy. Fermentation was among the most widespread and essential techniques. Without refrigeration, fresh milk spoiled within hours, particularly in summer. But when cultured intentionally or accidentally, it became something else entirely. Yogurt-like curds and soured milk were common across rural households, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. In Central and Western Europe, milk was routinely converted into cheese. By the 12th century, cheese production had become highly regionalized, with specific techniques passed through monastic orders, farming communities, and guilds. Hard cheeses such as Parmigiano in northern Italy or Alpine variants in Switzerland and Austria could last for months, even years. In monasteries, like the Benedictine abbeys of Normandy and Burgundy, cheese was aged in cellars with consistent humidity and airflow conditions ideal for fermentation. Bread, too, was often a product of fermentation. Before the availability of commercial yeast, leavening depended on wild strains present in flour and the environment. Sourdough starters were cultivated by allowing flour and water mixtures to ferment over several days. This culture, refreshed daily, produced loaves with a tangy flavor and increased digestibility. Across medieval Europe, sourdough was the dominant form of leavened bread. In towns and cities, communal ovens baked large batches, with individual households contributing their own dough, shaped and marked for identification. Vegetables were also transformed through fermentation. Cabbage, when finely shredded, salted, and pressed under weight, became sauerkraut. The lactic acid produced during fermentation preserved the cabbage and enhanced its nutritional value, particularly crucial in winter. When fresh greens were scarce, though widely associated with Germanic regions, similar techniques were practiced across Central and Eastern Europe. In Slavic territories, pickled and fermented vegetables formed a central part of the diet, especially during Orthodox fasting periods when meat and dairy were forbidden. Alcohol was perhaps the most socially significant product of fermentation. Ale, beer, mead, and wine were consumed daily, not only for enjoyment, but for safety. In many regions, water sources were unreliable or contaminated, and low-alcohol drinks were considered safer. Ale, made from fermented barley, was a staple in England and the Low Countries. In wine-producing regions like Gascony, Tuscany, and the Rhineland, viticulture and fermentation became highly developed trades by the High Middle Ages. Wine was fermented in wooden barrels or clay amphorae, with seasonal cycles dictating harvest and storage. The lack of microbial knowledge didn't stop innovation. Vineyards experimented with grape varieties, soil conditions, and aging techniques, despite having no understanding of yeast or bacteria. Medieval people developed a sophisticated command of fermentation's results. They recognized the signs of successful fermentation, the bubbles, the smells, the textures, refined their methods over generations. In monasteries, abbots documented brewing techniques. In towns, bakers maintained starters and adjusted for humidity and temperature. In villages, fermentation was ritualized into seasonal life, tied to harvests, fasts, and festivals. Fermentation wasn't merely a way to prevent spoilage, it was a deliberate act of transformation, guided by taste, trial, and tradition. In a world governed by perishable goods and unpredictable seasons, this process stood as one of medieval Europe's most reliable tools for nourishment and survival. The belief that medieval cooks used spices solely to mask the flavor of spoiled meat is a modern misconception, one that overlooks the economic, culinary, and medicinal realities of the period. In truth, spices and herbs served multiple roles in food preservation and preparation, but disguising decay was not their primary function. For most people, spoiled food wasn't eaten at all. It was a serious health risk, and medieval societies, though lacking microbiology, understood the danger through experience. Spices were expensive. Imports like black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger came overland through the Silk Road or by ship via Venetian and Genoese merchants. These goods, often transported from India, Southeast Asia, or East Africa, were subject to high tariffs and monopolistic control. By the 13th century, the spice trade had become one of Europe's most lucrative enterprises. Cloves from the Maluku Islands, pepper from the Malabar coast, and cinnamon from Ceylon could fetch prices measured in gold. These were luxury items, often kept under lock and key in the homes of nobles, clergy, and wealthy merchants, not something to be wasted on rotten meat. In elite kitchens, spices were used sparingly but strategically. Recipes from the form of curry, compiled in the late 14th century for the court of Richard II, often featured combinations of saffron, pepper, and ginger to enhance sauces, meats, or stews. These spices added flavor, complexity, and status, not concealment. Their presence on the table was as much a display of wealth and sophistication as it was culinary design. Herbs, by contrast, were widely available and deeply integrated into daily cooking. Grown in monastic gardens, village plots, or even in kitchen window boxes, herbs like sage, thyme, parsley, dill, and mint were common throughout Europe. Some, such as rosemary and bay, did have mild antimicrobial properties, and their inclusion in salted or smoked meats may have contributed marginally to preservation. But more often, herbs were used to complement preservation methods rather than replace them. The overlap between food and medicine played a key role in their use. Medieval medical theory, heavily influenced by Galenic principles, emphasized balancing the body's humors. Foods were categorized as hot, cold, moist, or dry. Spices and herbs were selected based on how they might correct an imbalance. Ginger was considered warming and used to aid digestion. Mint and fennel helped with bloating. Cloves were believed to preserve not only food but vitality. In many cases, the choice of seasoning reflected a combination of taste, health, and cultural prescription. The practical use of spices and herbs often intersected with seasonal realities. In cold months, when salted or smoked meats dominated the table, strong seasonings helped create variety and palatability. In fasting seasons, when meat was restricted, spices made fish and vegetable dishes more appealing. But the idea that expensive saffron or imported cinnamon was used to salvage rancid food ignores the economic and social logic of the time. Spices and herbs were valued for what they added, not what they concealed. Their role in medieval cuisine reveals not desperation, but a deliberate blend of taste, medicine, and ritual shaped by a complex and deeply structured food culture in medieval Europe. The ability to preserve food was closely tied to class, land, and labor. Preservation was not just about survival. It was a reflection of who controlled resources and, by extension, who held power. Noble estates, manors, and monasteries had access to infrastructure, materials, and labor that made long-term storage possible on a much larger scale. Their larders were more than storage spaces. They were supply chains built to maintain authority and withstand scarcity. Salted beef, smoked hams, barrels of pickled vegetables, wheels of aged cheese, dried herbs, and casks of ale lined the shelves of elite kitchens. Dedicated smokehouses, stone-walled pantries, cool cellars, and expansive granaries allowed the landed class to maintain a year-round reserve. Icehouses began appearing on some noble estates by the 14th and 15th centuries, extending the capacity to store perishables even into the warmer months. Innovation limited almost entirely to the elite. For peasants, preservation looked different. Options were constrained by cost, access to materials, and space. Salt, when available, was expensive. In inland regions far from natural sources, it could consume a significant portion of a household's income. Most rural families relied on basic, time-tested methods: drying herbs and mushrooms, fermenting vegetables, storing root crops in cellars or earthen pits, and stretching meat through smoking or brining if livestock were slaughtered at all. Slaughtering a pig or goat typically happened only once a year, usually in the late autumn when temperatures dropped and preservation became viable. Women were central to this domestic economy, from the aristocratic lady overseeing estate kitchens to the peasant wife preserving cabbage in clay jars. Women carried the knowledge and labor of preservation. Recipes were not always written, but passed orally, refined through practice and observation. Techniques varied by region: fermentation styles in Eastern Europe, herb drying traditions in the Mediterranean, smoked fish in Scandinavia, yet they were sustained by women managing household survival across generations. In monastic communities, particularly Benedictine and Cistercian orders, food storage and preservation became structured practices. Monks maintained detailed records of cheese, aging, ale brewing, and vegetable pickling. Their surplus often supplied nearby villages or was sold in town markets. This allowed monasteries to function not just as religious centers, but as local, Suppliers and economic anchors. Local knowledge networks were vital. Community events, such as seasonal fairs or church gatherings, provided opportunities to exchange preservation techniques. Shared ovens in towns allowed multiple families to bake or dry food communally. For many peasants, survival through winter depended not on solitary innovation, but on collective experience. Control over preservation meant control over sustenance, trade, and stability. Those with land and labor shaped the rhythms of feasting and fasting. Those without relied on skill, shared labor, and endurance. In both cases, preservation was not just a technique, it was a reflection of status, access, and a fragile balance between hunger and plenty. When preservation failed, the cost was measured in human lives. Medieval Europe, dependent on the land and the weather, teetered on the edge of scarcity year after year. Food preservation wasn't simply a convenience, it was a defense against collapse. And when that defense crumbled, the consequences were immediate and devastating. In the early 14th century, Europe faced one of its most catastrophic food crises, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, triggered by relentless rain and crop failure. It exposed the limits of medieval storage systems. Granaries flooded, salted meat rotted, hay spoiled in the fields. Without preserved stores to fall back on, entire regions descended into hunger. Contemporary accounts describe people eating bark, grass, and the flesh of dead animals. Chroniclers like Jean de Venette and the Annales recorded the deaths of thousands, especially in towns where supply chains broke down completely. But the Great Famine was not unique. Seasonal scarcity was a recurring feature of the medieval calendar, known as the starving time. The months from late winter to early spring, before the first fresh crops emerged, were perilous. Stocks of grain and salted meat dwindled. Dairy animals, lean from cold and poor feed, produced little. For peasant families, the final weeks before spring harvests were the most difficult. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, setting the stage for disease outbreaks. Preservation was meant to bridge that gap. Dried beans, smoked pork, salted herring, fermented cabbage, each item stored in a cellar or hung from a beam was a barrier against starvation. When those supplies failed due to mold, pests, or miscalculation, the margin for survival narrowed sharply. In agrarian villages across northern Europe, where bread made from rye or barley was the main calorie source, a spoiled grain store could push a family toward hunger in a matter of weeks. Preserved food wasn't just vital for the poor. Castles, monasteries, and towns maintained stores for lean times. In wartime or siege, preservation became critical. During the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, King John's forces surrounded the rebel stronghold. As weeks passed, the besieged defenders consumed nearly everything available. Salted meat and dried legumes kept them alive, but only barely. When supplies finally ran out, surrender followed swiftly. Disease followed famine. Weakened by hunger, populations became more susceptible to outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, and, in later centuries, plague. The link between poor nutrition and mortality was clear to medieval chroniclers, even if the mechanisms remained mysterious. Hunger spread not just physical weakness, but social unrest. Food riots, theft, and peasant uprisings often followed. Periods of scarcity in every household, whether rural or urban. Preservation was a hedge against that chaos. Its failure meant hunger. Hunger led to desperation, and desperation reshaped societies from abandoned farms to empty villages. from increased vagrancy to harsher laws against theft. In some years, survival depended less on the harvest itself than on what could be saved from it. By the close of the Middle Ages, preservation remained as crucial as it had ever been. Before refrigeration, before industrial agriculture, food preservation wasn't an option. It was the line between endurance and collapse, between a full winter and a fatal one.